62 CE, Rome. The imperial villa at Pandateria, a barren island prison 40 miles from the coast of Italy, where Rome sent those too dangerous to execute publicly, but too important to let live. Princess Octavia, the rightful Empress of Rome, sat in a stone chamber, waiting. She was 21 years old, daughter of Emperor Claudius, sister of Britannicus, wife of Nero, and she was about to die in a way so brutal, so methodical, so politically calculated, that even Rome, a civilization built on blood and spectacle, would whisper about it in horror for generations. History remembers Nero as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, the mad tyrant, the matricide, the theatrical narcissist who murdered his way to absolute power. But there's one murder that historians have softened, romanticized, or simply skipped over entirely. What Nero did to Octavia wasn't just political assassination. It wasn't simply the removal of an inconvenient wife. It was systematic psychological torture, followed by execution, designed to send a message so terrifying that no one would dare question imperial authority again. And the truly disturbing part? It was all legal, all justified under Roman law, all approved by a Senate too terrified to object. This is the story of what happened in the weeks between Octavia's exile and her execution. The psychological warfare, the false accusations, the manufactured evidence. The moment when Octavia realized that her husband, the boy she'd been forced to marry at 13, was going to destroy her completely. And once you understand what Nero did to Octavia, you'll see that his legend of madness was carefully constructed propaganda. Because what he actually did was far more rational, far more calculated, and far more chilling than simple insanity. This is that story. And it starts not with Octavia's death, but with her marriage. A marriage arranged by Nero's mother that would doom both of them from the very beginning. To understand why Nero destroyed Octavia so thoroughly, we need to go back 13 years, to 49 CE, when Octavia was a child and Nero was still called Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Neither of them chose this marriage, neither of them wanted it. But Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother and one of the most ruthlessly ambitious women in Roman history, understood something that would shape the entire Roman Empire. Whoever married Octavia would have an unassailable claim to the throne. Here's the political calculation that sealed Octavia's fate. Her father was Emperor Claudius, making her a Julio-Claudian princess with direct bloodline to Augustus himself. Her brother Britannicus was Claudius's son and heir. She represented legitimacy in a way that no amount of military power or senatorial approval could match. Agrippina had already maneuvered her way into becoming Claudius's fourth wife, his niece technically, which required a special senatorial decree to make the incestuous marriage legal. But marriage to the emperor wasn't enough. She needed to secure the succession for her son. So she did something extraordinary, something that required dismantling an existing betrothal and rewriting family relationships. She convinced Claudius to adopt her 12-year-old son as his own heir, making Nero officially Octavia's brother. Then, she convinced him to break that adoption's implications and betroth them anyway. Think about the psychological architecture of this arrangement. Octavia was 8 years old when Agrippina became her stepmother. She watched this woman, who was simultaneously her father's wife, her adoptive brother's mother, and soon her mother-in-law, systematically eliminate everyone who threatened Nero's path to power. First, Agrippina had Claudius's previous wife's son removed from succession. Then she arranged for Octavia's previous betrothed, Lucius Silanus, to be accused of incest with his own sister, a false charge that led to his suicide on the very day of Claudius and Agrippina's wedding. Octavia learned young what it meant to be a pawn in imperial politics. Your betrothed dies to make room for someone else's son. Your brother, the rightful heir, gets sidelined for your adopted brother. Your own marriage becomes a tool to legitimize someone else's claim to power. The wedding took place in 53 CE. Octavia was 13 years old. Nero was 15. Roman sources describe Octavia as beautiful, virtuous, educated in the traditional Roman manner, everything a princess should be. But they also describe her as quiet, reserved, emotionally withdrawn. Of course she was. She'd spent 5 years watching her family be systematically destroyed to make room for her husband's ambitions. And Nero? The sources paint a more complex picture than the mad tyrant legend suggests. As a teenager, he was reportedly charming, artistically talented, fascinated by Greek culture, and completely dominated by his mother. That last part is crucial, because the marriage that was supposed to legitimize Nero's rule became instead a cage for both of them. Octavia represented everything Nero couldn't have: freedom, choice, authentic power that came from his own merit rather than his mother's machinations. And for Octavia, Nero represented the man who had stolen her brother's birthright, whose mother had murdered her way into the imperial family, and whose very existence as emperor was built on the erasure of Octavia's own family. 1 year after the wedding, Emperor Claudius died, poisoned almost certainly by Agrippina, who fed him poisoned mushrooms and then, when he began to recover, had the physician insert a poisoned feather down his throat, supposedly to induce vomiting. Nero became emperor at 16. Octavia became empress at 14. And Britannicus, Octavia's full brother, the rightful heir, the one person who might have protected her, died 4 months later, also poisoned, convulsing and choking at a dinner party while Nero watched. The sources say Nero claimed it was an epileptic fit. The sources also say that Britannicus's body was covered in chalk dust before his funeral to hide the discoloration from the poison. Octavia was now completely alone, her father dead, her brother murdered, married to the man who had taken everything from her family, and her mother-in-law, Agrippina, controlled every aspect of imperial life. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, Octavia lived in a strange limbo. She was empress, technically one of the most powerful women in Rome. She attended state functions. She appeared on coins alongside Nero. She performed the religious and ceremonial duties expected of an Augusta. But she had no real power, no children, suspiciously given that Roman noblewomen typically became mothers within a year or two of marriage, and no protection from the increasingly violent power struggle between Nero and Agrippina. Because that's what was really happening in the imperial palace during those early years, not a mad emperor terrorizing Rome, but a young man trying desperately to escape his mother's control. And Octavia, whether she wanted to be or not, was a symbol of that control. Every time Nero saw his wife, he saw his mother's ambitions. He saw the arranged marriage that gave him legitimacy, but also trapped him. He saw the living reminder that he was emperor not by right, but by adoption, manipulation, and murder. The marriage was never consummated in any meaningful way. Multiple sources suggest Nero avoided Octavia's bed, found excuses not to spend time with her, and openly pursued other women, including a freedwoman named Acte, whom he apparently genuinely cared for. Agrippina was furious. She had arranged this marriage specifically to produce heirs with Julio-Claudian blood. An heirless marriage meant her entire political strategy was failing. So she did what she always did. She escalated. She threatened to support Britannicus's claim before he died. She threatened to support other potential heirs. She reminded Nero constantly that he owed everything to her. And according to some sources we should treat carefully, but that multiple historians report, she offered to replace Octavia in Nero's bed herself. Whether or not Agrippina actually attempted incest with her son, the relationship had become toxic beyond repair, and in 59 CE, Nero finally did what he'd been planning for months. He killed his mother. The murder was elaborate, theatrical, and brutally efficient. First he tried to drown her in a collapsing boat. She swam to shore. Then he sent assassins to her villa, who beat her to death while she reportedly offered her womb to the sword, saying, "Strike here, where I carried the emperor." Rome was shocked. Matricide was considered one of the most heinous crimes possible, a violation of fundamental Roman values. But Nero's spin doctors, including the philosopher Seneca, went to work immediately. painting Agrippina as a threat to the state who had been plotting against her son. The Senate, terrified and compliant, officially thanked Nero for saving Rome from his mother's treachery. For Octavia, her mother-in-law's death changed everything. The woman who had orchestrated her marriage, murdered her father, poisoned her brother, and controlled every aspect of imperial politics was gone. You might think this would improve Octavia's situation. You would be wrong, because with Agrippina dead, there was nothing tying Nero to Octavia anymore. The marriage had served its political purpose, legitimizing Nero's early reign. But now, established as emperor for 5 years, with his mother's control finally broken, Nero wanted something Agrippina had never allowed him: freedom, choice, a life that wasn't dictated by political necessity. And Octavia, quiet, virtuous, legitimate Octavia, stood in his way. In 58 CE, 1 year before Agrippina's death, Nero had met a woman who would ultimately seal Octavia's fate. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Octavia wasn't: ambitious, seductive, politically savvy, willing to play the game. She was also married to Nero's friend Otho, but that didn't matter. Nero wanted her, and what Nero wanted, Nero took. He sent Otho away to govern Lusitania, modern Portugal, a prestigious appointment that was really an elegant exile, and he brought Poppaea into the palace, not yet as wife, but as mistress, confidant, and political partner. Poppaea was smart enough to understand that being Nero's mistress wasn't enough. She wanted to be empress, and that meant Octavia had to go. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Nero couldn't simply divorce Octavia. This wasn't a private marriage between two individuals. This was a political institution that legitimized the entire regime. Octavia's status as Claudius's daughter gave Nero his connection to the Julio-Claudian line. Divorcing her would raise questions about his right to rule. It would anger the substantial portion of Rome that still loved Octavia, and the sources are clear that the people adored her, seeing her as a virtuous victim of imperial politics. So Nero and Poppaea needed something more than simple divorce. They needed to destroy Octavia so thoroughly that her removal would seem not just justified, but necessary. They needed to turn Rome's most beloved princess into a criminal who deserved to die. And in 62 CE, they made their move. June 62 CE, 3 years after Agrippina's murder, Nero had been consolidating power, eliminating rivals, and growing increasingly bold in his disregard for traditional Roman values. Poppaea Sabina was pregnant, with Nero's child. Everyone knew it. The palace knew it, the Senate knew it, the people of Rome knew it. And this created an impossible situation. Nero had an heir coming, but that heir would be illegitimate as long as he was still married to Octavia. Roman law was complex on divorce, but imperial divorce was even more so. Technically, Nero could divorce Octavia for barrenness, a traditional and acceptable ground. But here's the problem. Barrenness implied a biological failure on the wife's part, but everyone in Rome knew the real reason Octavia had no children. Nero had barely touched her in 9 years of marriage. Divorcing her for barrenness would make Nero look weak, sexually inadequate, or worse, emotionally incapable of performing his imperial duty to produce heirs. So they needed a different strategy. They needed grounds for divorce that would make Octavia look like the guilty party, grounds so serious that her removal would seem like justice rather than political convenience. On June 9, 62 CE, Nero formally accused his wife of adultery. Now, adultery was technically a crime under Roman law. Augustus had made it a criminal offence as part of his moral reforms. But imperial adultery accusations were always political weapons, not genuine moral outrage. Augustus himself had used adultery charges to exile his daughter and granddaughter when they became political liabilities. What made Nero's accusation particularly audacious was the timing and the target. Octavia was famous throughout Rome for her virtue. She had lived an exemplary life, following every rule, fulfilling every duty, maintaining perfect decorum, even as her husband openly flaunted his mistress. Accusing her of adultery was like accusing a Vestal Virgin of breaking her vows. Theoretically possible, but it required extraordinary evidence because the accused's entire life contradicted the charge. So Nero and his advisors crafted something more specific, more believable, more damaging. They accused Octavia of having an affair with Anicetus, the admiral of the imperial fleet at Misenum. The choice of Anicetus was brilliant in its calculated cruelty. He was one of Nero's closest allies, the man who had actually carried out Agrippina's murder 3 years earlier. He was completely loyal to Nero, and he was about to be sacrificed to destroy Octavia. Anicetus was brought before Nero and given an offer. Confess to adultery with Octavia, accept exile to a comfortable estate in Sardinia with full wealth and privileges, and live out your days in luxury. Or refuse, and face torture and execution for your role in Agrippina's murder, a crime that could no longer be politically useful and could now be pinned on a convenient scapegoat. Anicetus chose survival. He confessed to a crime he didn't commit, provided detailed testimony about an affair that never happened, and described intimate encounters with the empress that were pure fiction. And Octavia, who had spent 9 years being ignored by her husband, who had maintained perfect virtue in the face of constant humiliation, who had never given anyone the slightest reason to question her character, suddenly found herself accused of the one crime that could justify her destruction. The Senate was called to hear the evidence. Not a trial exactly. Emperors' wives didn't receive public trials, but a formal presentation of charges that would justify the divorce and subsequent punishment. The senators knew this was theatre. They knew Anicetus was lying, they knew Octavia was innocent. But they also knew that contradicting Nero at this point meant death. One senator, Thrasea Paetus, a Stoic philosopher known for his integrity, did something remarkable and futile. He walked out of the Senate chamber rather than participate in the charade. He didn't vote against the charges, that would have been suicidal. He simply refused to be present for the legitimization of an obvious lie. Nero noted his absence. Thrasea would be forced to commit suicide 4 years later, charged with philosophical opposition to the regime. The Senate, minus Thrasea, formally accepted Anicetus's testimony. They declared that Octavia had committed adultery. They approved her divorce from Nero, the stripping of her title as Augusta, and her exile from Rome. All of this happened in less than a week. From accusation to divorce to exile, speed was essential to prevent public opposition from organizing. But Nero underestimated something crucial. The Roman people loved Octavia. She represented everything traditional Romans valued: legitimacy through bloodline, virtue in the face of adversity, dignity under humiliation. She was the last living child of Emperor Claudius, the last direct link to the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome for nearly a century. When news of the divorce spread through Rome, the city erupted. Crowds gathered in the Forum, demanding Octavia's restoration. They tore down statues of Poppaea and erected new ones of Octavia. They marched to the Palatine Hill, where the imperial palace stood, chanting Octavia's name. For one brief moment, it seemed like public outrage might actually save her. Nero's own Praetorian Guard, the elite troops who protected the emperor, looked uncertain, unwilling to attack Roman citizens defending their beloved princess. This was Nero's crisis point. He could back down, restore Octavia, accept that public opinion had limits he couldn't cross. Some emperors might have chosen that path, claimed the adultery charge was based on bad information, blame evil advisors, bring Octavia back and quietly maintain the status quo. Nero chose escalation instead. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to disperse the crowds, violently if necessary. He had the ringleaders of the demonstration arrested, and he issued a public statement. Octavia wasn't just an adulteress, she was a traitor who had conspired to turn the military against the emperor. This was a masterclass in authoritarian propaganda. Take legitimate public protest and reframe it as proof of the accused's guilt. The people defending Octavia weren't expressing genuine affection, they were dupes, manipulated by her conspiracy against the state. Sound familiar? This playbook is 20 centuries old and it still works. To make the conspiracy charge stick, Nero needed more than Anicetus's confession of adultery. He needed evidence of political treason. So his agents went looking for it, and when they couldn't find it, they manufactured it. Octavia's servants were arrested. Under Roman law, slave testimony was only admissible in court if obtained through torture, a legal principle that guaranteed whatever answers the interrogators wanted. Most of Octavia's slaves under torture told their torturers what they wanted to hear. Yes, Octavia had lovers. Yes, she had spoken against the emperor. Yes, she had conspired with military officers. But one slave, one woman whose name hasn't survived, identified in the sources only as one of Octavia's women, endured torture and refused to lie. The historian Tacitus records this moment with unusual detail, suggesting it was remembered because it was so remarkable. The interrogator, a man named Tigellinus who served as Nero's enforcer, pressed this woman through multiple sessions of torture. And according to Tacitus, she finally spat in Tigellinus's face and said, "My mistress's genitals are cleaner than your mouth." She was executed, of course, but her defiance was remembered, recorded, passed down through history as testimony to Octavia's actual character, testimony that came at the cost of this unknown woman's life. Despite this brave resistance, enough coerced testimony was obtained to construct a narrative of conspiracy. Nero presented the Senate with evidence that Octavia had plotted with military officers, that she had planned to use public sympathy to launch a coup, that her very existence as the legitimate Julio-Claudian heir made her an ongoing threat to stability. The Senate, already complicit in the adultery charges, went along with the treason accusation as well. They had no choice. Backing Octavia now would mean identifying themselves as part of her conspiracy. Octavia was moved from house arrest in Rome to formal exile on the island of Pandateria, the same island where Augustus had exiled his daughter Julia 60 years earlier. Pandateria was Rome's highest security prison for imperial family members too important to execute publicly, but too dangerous to leave free. It was barren, isolated, surrounded by guards, impossible to escape from. Octavia was 21 years old. She had been empress for 8 years and accomplished nothing. Not because she was incapable, but because she had never been allowed any real power. And now, exiled on this remote island, she must have known what was coming. Roman imperial history was clear. When emperors exiled family members, exile was just the first step toward execution. What Octavia couldn't have known was how meticulously Nero would orchestrate her final days, how every detail of her destruction would be carefully managed to send a message to anyone who might dare oppose him. She couldn't have known that Nero was about to demonstrate that being innocent meant nothing when you were in the way of imperial power. Pandateria, a volcanic rock jutting from the Tyrrhenian Sea, barely 2 miles long, its cliffs rising sharply from waters that made escape impossible. The island had a grim history as Rome's dumping ground for inconvenient imperial women. Augustus's daughter Julia had died there after 14 years of exile. Agrippina the Elder, Nero's grandmother, had been starved to death there by the Emperor Tiberius. Now it was Octavia's turn to join this tragic lineage of exiled princesses, women whose only crime was being related to emperors who saw them as threats. The sources tell us Octavia arrived at Pandateria in June of 62 CE, accompanied by guards who were really jailers and servants who were really informants, reporting her every word back to Rome. She was housed in a villa. Calling it comfortable would be grotesque, but it wasn't a dungeon. She had rooms, basic furnishings, access to the villa's small garden. From the outside, it might have looked like a dignified retirement rather than imprisonment. But Octavia understood the reality. She had grown up in the imperial palace. She knew how these stories ended. What happened during the weeks Octavia spent on Pandateria is where we must piece together fragments from multiple sources. But those fragments paint a picture of psychological torture as calculated as any physical brutality. Nero didn't simply want Octavia dead. He wanted her broken. He wanted her to confess, to validate the charges against her, to make her own destruction seem justified. Because here's what Nero understood about power. It's not enough to eliminate your enemies. You have to make their elimination seem inevitable, deserved, even merciful. So the psychological campaign began. First came the isolation. Octavia's remaining loyal servants, those who hadn't been tortured into giving false testimony, were removed and replaced with people loyal to Nero. Every conversation she had was reported. Every moment was surveillance. Imagine it. You're 21 years old, imprisoned on a barren island, surrounded by people whose job is to watch you suffer and report your suffering to the man who destroyed your life. Then came the rumors. Ships brought news from Rome, carefully curated news designed to demoralize her. Nero had married Poppaea in a lavish ceremony 12 days after Octavia's exile. Poppaea was being celebrated as the new Augusta, wearing Octavia's titles, using Octavia's ceremonial roles. The message was clear. You've been replaced. You were never necessary. Rome has already forgotten you. But there was something else in those rumors, something more insidious. News filtered to Octavia that some of her former allies, senators, military officers, even distant family members, were being arrested on conspiracy charges. People were dying because they had supported her. Their blood was on her hands simply because she existed. This is sophisticated psychological warfare. Make the victim feel responsible for collateral damage. Make survival itself feel like a moral failing, because every day you live, more people suffer for having known you. Tacitus suggests that Octavia was visited by imperial agents who offered her a way out. Confess to the adultery and conspiracy charges. Write a letter accepting full guilt. In exchange, her life would be spared. Perhaps permanent exile, but at least survival. And here's the cruelty of that offer. It was a lie. Nero had already decided she would die. But offering false hope, watching her grapple with the choice, seeing whether she would compromise her integrity to survive, that was part of the torture. According to the sources, Octavia refused. She maintained her innocence. She wouldn't give Nero the satisfaction of a confession that would validate everything he'd done to her. And that refusal, that final act of defiance from a woman with no power left except her integrity, signed her death warrant definitively. In Rome, Nero was facing his own pressure. Poppaea was paranoid that as long as Octavia lived, she remained a threat. Any coup, any military uprising, any senatorial conspiracy could rally around Octavia as the legitimate empress. Poppaea demanded Octavia's death, and she had leverage. She was pregnant with Nero's heir, the child that was supposed to secure the dynasty's future. Some sources suggest Poppaea even threatened miscarriage if Nero didn't eliminate Octavia permanently. Whether true or not, it reflects the stakes everyone understood. As long as Octavia lived, Poppaea's position was precarious. So in late June or early July, the exact date is uncertain, deliberately obscured in the sources, Nero sent the execution order to Pandateria. The executioners arrived by ship, imperial soldiers, professionals who had done this before. They brought with them specific instructions about how Octavia's death was to be carried out, because even in death, Nero needed to send a message. When the soldiers arrived at the villa, Octavia knew immediately why they had come. The ancient sources give us fragmented details of what happened next, and we should treat them carefully. These accounts were written by historians with their own agendas, trying to make sense of events decades after they occurred. But certain details appear consistently across multiple sources, suggesting they were remembered, repeated, passed down because they were true. Octavia didn't beg. She didn't plead for mercy. She didn't offer the confession that might have delayed the inevitable. Tacitus, writing about 40 years after these events, describes her as showing courage beyond her years, maintaining imperial dignity even in the face of execution. The execution method was specific and significant. She was to be bound, have her veins opened in the Roman style of forced suicide, and then placed in an overheated bath to accelerate the bleeding. This was Rome's merciful execution for nobles, dying by blood loss in warm water, which supposedly made the process faster and less painful than other methods. But there was an additional element, something that revealed the depths of Nero's calculated cruelty. Before the bleeding began, Octavia was to be beaten, not tortured for information. What information could she possibly have? But beaten to show that her noble status meant nothing, that her innocence meant nothing, that all her virtue and dignity could be reduced to physical suffering. The sources describe her being restrained by soldiers, while others struck her repeatedly. Some accounts suggest they focused on her face, destroying the beauty that had once been celebrated throughout Rome, making her unrecognizable. Then they opened her veins, wrists and elbows, the standard method. They placed her in the heated bath and watched her bleed. But here's where the accounts become truly horrifying. Octavia was young and healthy. Even with opened veins, even in the heated water designed to accelerate blood loss, she was dying too slowly. The executioners had orders. The body needed to return to Rome quickly. There were political reasons for this we'll discuss in a moment. They couldn't wait for natural blood loss to complete the job, so they placed her in an even hotter bath, hot enough to cause steam burns. And when that still didn't kill her fast enough, they decapitated her. Octavia, daughter of Emperor Claudius, Empress of Rome, convicted of adultery and treason on manufactured evidence, died by decapitation in an overheated bath on a prison island 40 miles from the city she had once ruled. She was 21 years old. She had been married to Nero for 9 years. She had spent her entire adult life being used as a political pawn, then discarded, then destroyed when she was no longer useful. But Nero's calculated cruelty didn't end with Octavia's death. What happened to her body reveals the final layer of his psychological warfare, not just against Octavia, but against anyone who might oppose him. Octavia's head was cut from her body and preserved in salt or honey, the Roman method for preventing decomposition during transport. Then it was shipped back to Rome and presented to Poppaea. Multiple sources confirm this detail. Nero had Octavia's severed head brought to Poppaea as a gift, as proof of his devotion, as reassurance that the threat was eliminated. And Poppaea, according to the historian Dio Cassius, examined the head carefully to verify it was genuinely Octavia before accepting it as confirmation of her rival's death. Think about the symbolism. Think about what that act communicated to everyone in Rome who heard about it, and everyone heard about it, because such things couldn't be kept secret. The message was, this is what happens to imperial women who stand in the way. This is what happens to virtue and legitimacy when they conflict with power. This is what happens when you refuse to confess to crimes you didn't commit. Your innocence won't save you. Your bloodline won't save you. Public sympathy won't save you. Nothing will save you if the emperor wants you destroyed. Octavia's body, headless, was cremated on Pandateria and her ashes scattered or disposed of without ceremony. No state funeral, no mourning period, no memorial. In Rome, the Senate, the same Senate that had approved her marriage, witnessed her years as empress and then validated the charges against her, officially declared her a traitor whose memory should be damned. Damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Her name was to be chiseled from monuments, her images destroyed. History itself was supposed to forget she existed. But Rome didn't forget. The people who had loved her, who had rioted in her defense, who had recognized the injustice even as they were powerless to stop it, they remembered. And their memory of what happened to Octavia would shape how Romans viewed Nero for the rest of his reign, and for 2,000 years afterward. In the immediate aftermath of Octavia's execution, Nero appeared to have achieved exactly what he wanted. The inconvenient wife was eliminated. Poppaea was secure as empress. The Senate had validated every step of the process. Opposition had been crushed. For a few months, it seemed like the calculated brutality had worked. But something had shifted in Rome's collective consciousness, something that Nero, for all his political intelligence, had fundamentally miscalculated. The Roman people had watched their beloved princess, the last legitimate link to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, be systematically destroyed on manufactured charges. They had watched innocence mean nothing. They had watched virtue be punished while corruption was rewarded, and they stopped believing in the system. This is the hidden consequence of Octavia's murder that historians often overlook. It wasn't just about one woman's tragedy. It was about the moment when Roman citizens realized that imperial power had become completely arbitrary, that no amount of legitimacy or virtue could protect you. that the law was simply a tool to legitimize whatever the emperor wanted. Nero had broken something fundamental in the social contract between emperor and people. In January of 63 CE, just 6 months after Octavia's death, Poppaea gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Claudia, after Octavia's father, a naming choice that reveals just how much Nero still needed that Claudian legitimacy, even after destroying the woman who embodied it. The baby died 4 months later. Sudden infant death, the sources suggest, though of course rumours spread that it was divine punishment for Octavia's murder. Nero and Poppaea never had another child. The dynasty that was supposed to be secured by eliminating Octavia remained without a legitimate heir. In 64 CE, the Great Fire of Rome destroyed much of the city. Whether Nero started it, the famous "fiddling while Rome burned" legend, is historically dubious, but what's certain is that Romans blamed him. Why were they so quick to believe the worst about their emperor? Because they had watched him destroy Octavia. They had seen what he was capable of when someone stood in his way. The trust was gone. Every subsequent action Nero took was interpreted through the lens of Octavia's murder, proof that the emperor was capable of any atrocity if it served his purposes. In 65 CE, a serious conspiracy against Nero was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, involving senators, equestrians, even members of the Praetorian Guard. Dozens of prominent Romans were executed, including the philosopher Seneca, who had helped craft the justification for Octavia's divorce. Some of those conspirators explicitly mentioned Octavia's fate as justification for removing Nero. Her ghost haunted the regime. In 65 CE, Poppaea died. According to Tacitus and Suetonius, Nero kicked her in the stomach during an argument while she was pregnant with their second child. She died from internal injuries, along with the unborn baby. Whether this account is accurate or propaganda designed to further blacken Nero's reputation, the fact remains. The woman for whom Nero had destroyed Octavia, the woman who was supposed to provide the dynasty with heirs, was dead within 3 years of becoming empress, leaving no surviving children. Everything Nero had sacrificed Octavia for, legitimacy through a fertile marriage, political stability through a powerful empress, an heir to secure the succession, had failed. By 68 CE, just 6 years after Octavia's death, Nero's regime was collapsing. The military turned against him, the Senate declared him a public enemy, governors in the provinces declared independence. Nero fled Rome and committed suicide in a suburban villa, reportedly crying, "What an artist dies in me," as he drove a dagger into his throat. He was 30 years old. He had reigned for 14 years, and he died alone, abandoned by the same people who had helped him destroy Octavia. Here's what makes this story so important. Nero's destruction of Octavia wasn't exceptional. It was standard operating procedure for imperial power. Augustus exiled his daughter Julia on adultery charges that were almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated. Tiberius starved Nero's grandmother Agrippina the Elder to death on Pandateria. Caligula executed his sisters on conspiracy charges. Claudius executed his wife Messalina. Imperial women were always expendable when they became politically inconvenient. What made Octavia's case different was the thoroughness of the documentation, the public nature of the destruction, and the speed with which it all happened. We know what happened to Octavia in unusual detail because Romans themselves were shocked by it. Historians recorded it because it seemed excessive even by the brutal standards of imperial Rome. Writers returned to it repeatedly because it exemplified something important about power and its corruption. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If Octavia's story shocks us, it should make us question how many similar stories were successfully buried, how many women were destroyed with enough discretion that history forgot them entirely. Octavia is remembered precisely because Nero's method was so transparent, so obviously manufactured, so publicly visible that it couldn't be hidden. How many Octavias died quietly, their accusations believable enough that historians accepted them, their suppressions efficient enough that no one remembered to record their innocence? There's a play, Octavia, that may have been written within a generation of these events, attributed to Seneca, though he probably didn't write it. The play portrays Octavia as a tragic heroine, Nero as a tyrant, and Poppaea as a scheming villainess. It's not historically accurate in its details. It gets chronology wrong, invents conversations, adds elements that are clearly dramatic invention. But it's important because it shows how quickly Octavia became a symbol, not just a person, but a representation of innocence destroyed by tyrannical power, of virtue punished while vice was rewarded, of the ultimate powerlessness of legitimacy against brute force. Later Roman historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, all include Octavia's story in their accounts of Nero's reign, and they include it not as a minor detail, but as a pivotal moment that reveals the emperor's true character. For Tacitus especially, writing about 50 years after these events, Octavia represents everything noble about the old republic that had been destroyed by imperial autocracy. But here's what we need to understand about why this story matters today, 2,000 years later. The techniques Nero used to destroy Octavia are not ancient history. They are the playbook for authoritarian power in every era. First, manufacture a crime that justifies elimination. Octavia's adultery charge was fabricated from coerced testimony and a false confessor, but it gave legal cover for divorce and exile. Second, escalate when challenged. When public opinion defended Octavia, Nero didn't back down. He added treason charges and portrayed the defense of innocence as proof of guilt. Third, use torture and coercion to create evidence. Most of Octavia's servants, under torture, told interrogators what they wanted to hear. The one who refused was killed and her testimony ignored. Fourth, make institutions complicit. The Senate approved every step: divorce, exile, execution, making it systemically legitimate even though everyone knew it was unjust. Fifth, control the narrative. Nero attempted damnatio memoriae, trying to erase Octavia from history itself, making it as if she had never existed. Every authoritarian regime in history has used these same techniques. Different cultures, different technologies, but the same basic playbook for destroying inconvenient people while maintaining a facade of legitimacy. What makes Octavia's story particularly powerful is that it failed in its ultimate objective. Nero tried to erase her from memory, but instead her destruction became the defining moment of his reign. When we think of Nero today, we think of excess, cruelty, the burning of Rome, the persecution of Christians. But for Romans living through his reign, Octavia's murder was the moment they understood what kind of emperor they had. There's something else we need to acknowledge. Octavia had no good choices. Every decision available to her led to suffering or death. She could have confessed a crime she didn't commit, accepting guilt for false adultery and treason. This might have delayed her execution, but it would have validated everything Nero did to her and destroyed her historical reputation. She could have fled, though where would she go? Every territory around the Mediterranean was either controlled by Rome or dependent on Roman favour. There was nowhere an escaped Roman empress could hide. She could have fought back politically, but she had no power base, no military support, no wealthy allies willing to risk Nero's wrath. The one time the Roman people tried to defend her, Nero crushed the demonstration with violence. The only choice Octavia really had was how she would face her destruction, and she chose dignity. She chose to maintain her innocence. She chose to refuse the false confession that might have bought her a few more months of life. That choice, to die with integrity rather than survive through self-betrayal, is why we remember her. Not because she successfully resisted. She didn't. Nero won in the immediate sense. Octavia died, Poppaea became empress, opposition was crushed. But history is written over centuries, not years, and in the long accounting Octavia won. Her name survived, her innocence is recognized, her story is told. While Nero is remembered as a byword for tyranny, for the kind of emperor whose name becomes synonymous with cruelty and excess, there's a final element to this story that we need to address: complicity. Nero didn't destroy Octavia alone. He had help from senators who approved false charges, from interrogators who tortured innocent servants, from executioners who carried out brutal orders, from historians who initially accepted or softened the official narrative. And most insidiously, from ordinary Romans who knew it was wrong but didn't risk opposing it because opposition was dangerous and futile. That's the real horror of authoritarian power. It doesn't just corrupt leaders, it corrupts entire systems, making good people complicit in atrocities because resisting seems pointless and dangerous. The senator who walked out rather than vote on Octavia's charges, Thrasea Paetus, didn't save her. His gesture accomplished nothing except his own later execution. But history remembers that gesture. History records that someone refused to participate, even when refusal was futile, just as history remembers the unnamed slave woman who endured torture rather than lie about Octavia. She didn't save her mistress either, but her defiance testified to truth when everyone else with power was constructing lies. These small acts of integrity, futile in their moment, become historically significant precisely because they were rare, because they were costly, because they demonstrate that even in systems designed to make resistance impossible, some people chose conscience over survival. So what did Emperor Nero do to Princess Octavia after Rome fell? Or more accurately, after Constantinople's fall forced us to confront historical parallels? He demonstrated that innocence is not protection against power, that virtue is not defense against violence, that legitimacy means nothing when it conflicts with an emperor's desires. He showed how systems can be made complicit in injustice, how courts, senates, and institutions designed to protect citizens can be weaponized to destroy them instead. He proved that authoritarian power requires not just violence, but the appearance of legitimacy, the performance of justice, the systematic destruction of truth itself. And Octavia, through her suffering, through her refusal to validate lies even at the cost of her life, through the very brutality of her destruction that shocked witnesses into remembering and recording, demonstrated something equally important: that tyrants can destroy individuals, but cannot ultimately control how history remembers them. That truth, even when suppressed, has a way of surviving in fragments that later generations can piece together. That integrity in the face of power, even when it accomplishes nothing immediate, creates a record that outlasts empires. Nero tried to erase Octavia from history. Instead, her story became his epitaph, the defining proof of exactly the kind of tyrant he was. 2,000 years later, we tell her story. We speak her name. We honour her memory by refusing to let historical erasure succeed. Princess Octavia died on Pandateria in the summer of 62 CE. Her head was severed and presented to her rival. Her body was burned without ceremony. Her name was condemned to be forgotten. But here we are, 2 millennia later, speaking her name, telling her story, refusing to let that erasure succeed. That's the power of historical memory. That's why these stories matter. That's why we can't let them be buried, sanitized, or forgotten. When I started researching this story, I thought I was investigating the fall of Rome, the dramatic moment when the Roman Empire began its long decline, when Nero's excesses became so extreme that they destabilized the entire system. But what I found was something more intimate and more universal than imperial collapse. I found a story about a young woman placed in an impossible situation, who maintained her integrity even when integrity guaranteed her destruction. I found a story about how power justifies itself through manufactured evidence, coerced testimony, complicit institutions, and the systematic rewriting of truth. And I found a story that's being repeated in different forms, in different places, right now, today, in our own time. Because here's what we need to understand. The techniques that Nero used to destroy Octavia didn't die with the Roman Empire. They're the foundational playbook for authoritarian power in every era. Manufacture accusations against inconvenient people. Use institutional authority to legitimize injustice. coerce testimony through torture or threat, punish those who refuse to participate in lies, control the historical narrative to erase uncomfortable truths. We see these patterns in medieval kingdoms, in colonial empires, in 20th century dictatorships, in contemporary authoritarian states. The technology changes, the specific accusations vary, but the fundamental structure remains the same. Power protecting itself by destroying those who threaten it, then rewriting history to make that destruction seem justified, necessary, even merciful. Octavia's story teaches us to recognize these patterns, to understand that when we see manufactured accusations, when we see institutions abandoning their principles to serve power, when we see truth being systematically destroyed, we're watching an ancient script being performed with new actors. But her story also teaches us something more hopeful. Tyrants lose. Not always immediately, not always in their own lifetimes, but in the long accounting of history, truth has a resilience that propaganda doesn't. Nero tried to erase Octavia and failed. His official historians, his complicit Senate, his systematic suppression of evidence, none of it worked. Fragments survived, witnesses remembered, later historians pieced the truth together, because some truths are too important to stay buried. There's a phrase in Latin that survived from the Roman period, veritas filia temporis, truth is the daughter of time. It means that truth, even when suppressed, has a way of emerging eventually. Time reveals what propaganda tries to hide. Historical distance allows us to see patterns that contemporary witnesses, trapped in fear or complicity, couldn't acknowledge. But here's the crucial part. Truth doesn't reveal itself automatically. It requires people willing to look for it, to piece together fragments, to challenge official narratives, to remember what power once forgotten. Every historian who recorded Octavia's story, even partially, even in coded language, was an act of resistance against Nero's attempted erasure. Every copyist who preserved those manuscripts through the medieval period, when texts were expensive and only important works were worth copying, was making a choice that Octavia's story mattered. Every modern scholar who translates those sources, analyzes those fragments, reconstructs the truth from scattered evidence, is continuing that resistance against historical amnesia. And everyone watching this video, learning this story, refusing to accept the sanitized version where Octavia simply died in exile, you are part of that resistance too. This is why I make these videos, not just to share dramatic historical stories, though Octavia's story is certainly dramatic, but to demonstrate that history is never really settled, that official narratives are always suspect, that the powerful have always tried to control how they're remembered, and that our job, as students of history, as inheritors of these stories, is to resist that control. Octavia can't be saved. She died 2,000 years ago in circumstances of calculated cruelty. Nothing we do now changes that tragedy, but we can refuse to let her erasure succeed. We can tell her story. We can speak her name. We can honour her memory by understanding exactly what was done to her and why. And by understanding her story, we can recognise the same patterns when they appear in our own time. We can see manufactured accusations for what they are. We can question institutional complicity. We can refuse to accept official narratives without evidence. We can be the witnesses that Octavia needed but didn't have, the people willing to see truth and testify to it, even when testimony is dangerous or futile. Before we close, I want to acknowledge something important. This video took months to research and produce. I consulted primary sources in Latin, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius. I reviewed modern historical scholarship on Nero's reign, on Roman imperial women, on the propaganda techniques of authoritarian power. I worked to piece together fragments that were deliberately scattered, to distinguish between documented facts and later embellishments, to understand not just what happened, but why it was hidden and how it was revealed. This kind of historical work, deep research, careful analysis, resisting simplified narratives, is increasingly rare in an age of sound bites and superficial content. But it's more important than ever, because authoritarian power depends on people accepting simplified narratives, not asking difficult questions, forgetting inconvenient truths. So here's what I'm asking you to do. First, hit that like button, not for the algorithm, though that matters, but as a statement that detailed, researched, uncomfortable history matters, that Octavia's story deserves to be amplified, not buried. Second, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're examining what happened to other imperial women during Nero's reign, and their fates reveal a systematic pattern of destruction that goes far beyond Octavia. We'll investigate Agrippina the Younger's murder and how Nero's propaganda machine justified matricide. We'll explore the deaths of Poppaea and Statilia Messalina. We'll trace the pattern of how imperial power systematically eliminated women who became inconvenient. Third, and this is most important, drop a comment with just one word: Octavia. For 2,000 years, powerful people tried to erase her name from history. Every comment, every mention, every act of remembering is resistance against that erasure. It's a small thing, but small acts of resistance accumulate into historical memory. And finally, share this video. Share it with people who care about history. Share it with people who need to understand how power operates. Share it with people who think ancient history is irrelevant to modern life. Because Octavia's story is not ancient, it's happening now, in different forms, in different places, to different people whose names we might not know for another 2,000 years, if we remember them at all. Princess Octavia, daughter of Emperor Claudius, sister of Britannicus, wife and victim of Nero. She deserved better than the life she was given, better than the death she suffered, better than the erasure that was attempted. We can't give her justice. That's impossible across 2 millennia. But we can give her memory. We can give her truth. We can give her the acknowledgement that what happened to her was not justified, not necessary, not acceptable, regardless of what official sources claimed. We can be the resistance that the senators and the complicit institutions and the terrified citizens of Rome couldn't be. We can speak truth about power without fear of execution, because we live in a time and place where, at least for now, that remains possible. History is not a collection of facts about dead people. History is a conversation between past and present, a negotiation about what matters, what's remembered, what's forgotten, and why. Every time we tell stories like Octavia's, we're participating in that conversation. We're choosing what gets remembered. We're resisting the narrative control that power always seeks to maintain. And that choice, to remember, to testify, to refuse erasure, that's how truth becomes the daughter of time. Octavia's name was supposed to be forgotten. Instead, 2,000 years later, thousands of people are learning her story, understanding her suffering, honouring her memory. That's not victory in the way she would have wanted. She would have preferred to live, to be free, to have choices beyond dignity in death. But it's the victory that history allows, the defeat of erasure, the survival of truth, the refusal to let power write the final word. Rest in power, Princess Octavia. Your story is told, your name is spoken, your memory survives. And to everyone watching, remember her, tell her story, refuse to let it be forgotten, because that's how we honour the victims of power, not with mourning alone, but with memory that refuses to die. Thank you for watching. Comment Octavia below. Like, subscribe, share. And I'll see you next week when we explore the other women Nero destroyed, and the pattern of imperial violence that defined an entire era. Until then, remember, history is never just about the past, it's always about understanding the present and preparing for the future. And the greatest resistance against tyranny, across all times and places, is the refusal to forget.